We all know the GM LS engine is a popular choice for engine swaps. You can find it in everything from Jeeps, Miatas, Mustangs, planes, boats, helicopters, and more. It's everywhere. The thing is, there are a lot of different engines in the LS family, and they're all pretty good. Two of the most popular would be the LS1 and the LS3, but a lot of people don't know which one is better for their application. These two engines share a lot in common, but they also have a lot of differences, so let's dive in and talk about it. As you may or may not know, there are a few different generations of the LS family, Gen 3 and Gen 4. They share a lot in common, but as you might have guessed, the Gen 4 came at a later date and had some newer technologies such as cylinder deactivation and a couple of other key features. The main difference between all LS engines is the displacement, camshaft, intake manifold, the design of the cylinder heads, and whether or not it's made of aluminum or iron. There are lots of other small differences, but those are the main key differences. The obvious main difference between the LS1 and the LS3 would be displacement. LS1 has 5.7 liters of displacement and the LS3 has 6.2 liters of displacement. In theory, more displacement should mean more power with less work, but it doesn't always work that way. Now, fuel economy is increasingly important, so GM went ahead and made the L99 variant of the LS3, which is basically just an LS3 that includes cylinder deactivation, which is one of the cool features of the Gen 4 compared to the Gen 3. Of course, displacement is only one small part of the puzzle. It doesn't matter how much displacement you have if your cylinder heads cannot flow an adequate amount of air to keep the engine happy. When GM introduced the LS3, it had the best flowing heads of any small block engine up until that point, and still to this day it has really good flowing heads. The only LS engine that surpassed it as far as head flow would be the LS7. The LS1, like all Gen 3 LS engines, uses a cathedral style port, and depending on the flow bench that it's tested on and if there's any work done to the head, typically in stock form it'll flow anywhere from 220 to 240 CFM on the intake side. That's just a measurement of how much air it can flow per minute. On the other hand, the LS3, like all Gen 4 engines, uses a square style port instead of the cathedral style port, and depending on the flow bench, it'll flow anywhere from 300 to 340 CFM. It should be noted that these CFM numbers vary widely depending on how it's tested, the lift of the valve, and the flow bench itself. Even if you were to swap LS6 heads onto an LS1, you would still be short about 50 CFM compared to LS3 heads. Now, you might be wondering if you can put LS3 heads on an LS1. After all, most LS engine parts are interchangeable. Unfortunately, LS3 heads don't exactly bolt onto an LS1 very easily, and that's because of the minimum 4-inch bore that is required for the LS3 heads. The head will physically bolt on just fine, but you'll run into valve to block interference because of that bore limitation. There are a few aftermarket options, and it is possible to put LS3 heads on an LS1, but it's not the easiest thing in the world. If you do happen to swap the heads, you're also going to need to swap to an LS3 style intake manifold due to the change in port size compared to LS1 heads. Speaking of intake manifolds, that's the next big difference between these two engines. As we mentioned before, the LS1 uses a cathedral style port, which means that the intake manifold also has a cathedral style port to match the head. All other Gen 3 LS engines such as the LS2, LS6, and the truck engines also use cathedral style ports. It is possible to put an LS3 intake manifold on an LS1, but you're going to need a square port to cathedral port adapter, as well as various other little adapters. Now, on top of just the different port size, the LS3 intake manifold also uses slightly straighter runners and basically just flows more air. Objectively, it's better than the LS1 intake manifold in pretty much every single way. Realistically, swapping intake manifolds is not really worth it. It would be better to go just with an aftermarket option. If you're coming from a truck engine, it would be easiest to just use a stock LS1 intake on your truck engine, so that has much shorter runners, will make much better top end power, but it will lose some bottom end power. There are a lot of people who will argue that the cathedral style port is better than the square port, but in stock to stock form, the square port is a much better design and it flows more. Now, one of the biggest reasons the LS engine is so popular in the first place is the super low price. The thing is, there is a 10-year age gap between these two engines. The LS1 is pretty old and you can find it pretty much anywhere, whereas the LS3 is obviously 10 years newer and it is more expensive and harder to find. Now, that's not to say that you can't find either of them for super cheap, because you can, but there is generally a significant price difference. Now, when it comes to which one you should swap, again, it pretty much comes down to budget. There are a few things that make the LS1 easier to swap in, such as a cable-driven throttle instead of an electronically driven throttle, but for the most part it comes down to budget. They're both very lightweight and they both have very similar dimensions and can fit in a wide range of vehicles. They both have pretty much an equal amount of aftermarket support, so basically it just comes down to budget and ease of install. I know we covered this all really fast, but to answer the question which one is better, the LS3 is objectively better, money aside. It flows more air, it has a stronger block, it has more displacement, can ultimately make more power, but it is more expensive. Now, if budget is a huge limitation, the LS1 is the better option, but even better than that, like I said, would be a truck engine. That's all I've got for you guys today. Be sure to hit that thumbs up button and subscribe, and tell me if I'm right or wrong down in the comments below, and I will see you guys in the next video.